What do you do when you love something so much that you just want to share it with the world, but you're the only person that has ever even heard of it? This week, I'm going to talk about how I was the only kid in my entire school that ever played the Final Fantasy series. And I also wanted to highlight some of the cultural differences between the mid-90s to now, and highlight how different everything really is, especially in the gaming universe. So we're just going to jump right into it. Welcome to the Returners Hideout Final Fantasy podcast. My name is Lenard Phillips, and I just wanted to start by asking a question. And if you want to answer this question, just head over to youtube.com/The Returners Hideout. Leave a comment on any video. I have my notifications on, so I see every comment, and I respond to maybe about 95% of every comment. So I'll definitely at least read it. But my question is, what is your story with the Final Fantasy series? And did you have any weird or quirky things that happened to you because of the series? Now, I've covered this in a few different podcast videos, but I first saw the series in 1992. Final Fantasy IV was the first one I ever saw, but I really fell in love with the series around about 1995 whenever I got my own personal copy of Final Fantasy VI or III. That's when I realized how much I adored this series, and I mean, we only had 3 of them at the time, but I was head over heels in love with this whole series at this point. And it's something that I'm still in love with today, just I think in a different way than how it was when I was a kid. And when thinking about 1995, 1996, I think I was in 4th grade at the time. And when you're in 4th grade, I don't know, man, life is different when you're in 4th grade, and things are really starting to happen, and you're sort of realizing things in the world around you. And me having that outlet in Final Fantasy, I don't know, it was a way for me to, I don't want to say escape, because I mean things weren't awful where I was and what was going on. Things weren't too terrible. I mean, I'll go into that in a little bit, but things weren't really awful. Things had awful points, but overall it wasn't too bad. And also where I live played a role into my relationship with Final Fantasy outside of hanging out with my cousin Adam, who was the only other person I knew of that played the series. Outside of me hanging out with him, no one knew what it was. I mean, you know, my parents knew what it was because I talked about it endlessly. But no one else, I didn't have friends that played it. My sibling was so small that, I mean, there's no way they could have known what was going on and how much I loved the series. And growing up, I lived in a pretty conservative part of the country where the idea of working was getting your hands dirty, working on cars, building stuff. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. Those aren't just any of the things that I necessarily felt like doing. Not that I didn't feel like doing it, because I could. I had zero interest in doing those things. Growing up, I wanted to be an artist for a long time. I just wanted to draw all day. That's all I wanted to do. So I had this very sort of creative mind, and I didn't have that hardworking sense of building things, of you know, fixing problems with vehicles, you know, really putting elbow grease into something, you know. I didn't have that. I didn't want to do any of that. The level of interest I had for that was zero, and it still kind of is that way. Although granted, now me as a 30-something, like if something is happening at the house that needs fixing, like a doorknob, I mean, I'm on it. And I've turned into like a yard man. Like, I love yards. and like, so things change as you get older. But in those days, mid-90s, early to mid-90s, in those days, it was, I don't necessarily know that it was frowned upon, but it was pretty frowned upon if you played games a lot. And with some people that I knew growing up, they didn't even like video games. That was like, there's so many things you could be doing other than playing video games. Come on now. And to each their own. I don't care. But for me, that was my thing. You know, that was the thing that, I mean, I had music. I could always rely on music. I started playing music from a very young age. But video games that was my thing. That was my me time, I guess. That was my everybody go away. I'm going to focus on this thing now. And like I said, gaming wasn't necessarily looked down on, but it wasn't as prominent as it is now. And when I would say things like, oh, on my file of Final Fantasy VI, Terra is level 56. You know, I was met with, what's a level? You know, or people would ask me, what level are you on? And it's like, it doesn't work that way. Like, it's not, you know, it's not Mario Brothers. It's not a linear progression of level numbers. It's different. And I tried to explain it. A level is an indicator of how strong you are, not how far you are in the game. Well, I guess it could, but nobody got it. Nobody understood it. And not long after that is when the teasing and the bullying started. And I have to preface all of this by saying the teasing and the bullying, it wasn't as bad as some people got it. I was definitely bullied for it. I was definitely teased for it, but I wasn't as bad off as some other people that also got teased and bullied. I mean, throughout history, schools have always been sort of a place that can be pretty vicious at times, depending upon where you live, that sort of thing. Kids can be vicious sometimes, and it was no different, 30-something years ago. And so throughout the week, I endured this teasing, this bullying, like I said. That wasn't even necessarily bad, but for me, it was one of those things where, in my mind, I wasn't any of those things that I was being called. I just really liked this thing. And my own personality behind closed doors was nothing. And even in front of open doors, it was never that way. I was never these things. And so in my mind, it's like, what's wrong? What's wrong with me? What's wrong with them? This situation doesn't work. And I questioned everything. And that's how it was Monday through Friday, every day for a number of years. And last week, we talked about my cousin Adam. On the weekends, I would go over to his house, and that's when that dissipated. I had someone who was exactly like me in a lot of ways that I could talk about all this stuff to. And he would say the same things. It was like, Kids our age aren't playing Final Fantasy games. They're out fishing and hunting, doing a lot of agriculturally based stuff. And again, that's great. There is a huge need for those kind of things. But that's not us, and that's all right. But it wasn't all right, and that's the big difference. It was never all right, and because we weren't the same as those people. But it was what it was, and I think we both got a release whenever we visited each other, and there was like, oh, finally, like we can talk about this stuff openly. Gaming wasn't culturally accepted in those days at all. But when I went to Adam's house, it was the norm. It became the norm. It went from being a thing that you sort of keep under wraps and you don't really say anything about to then, oh, you haven't played fun? What's wrong with you? Now we were sort of the ones that were like, what's wrong with you? Although nobody came over and we could say that to you, but it was there. That was our thing. That was our big release, and it was fantastic. And even my parents, and I can understand it now as an adult, even my parents tried to dissuade me from not necessarily playing at all, but playing so much, because these games take a lot of time to beat, and they would see their son playing these games for 10-12 hours a day. Of course they're going to be concerned, and I understand it now. At the time I was like, it was, now I had kids in school that would tease me and bully me for playing these games or playing games at all, and I would go home and have my parents like, maybe you shouldn't play as much. And I took that as like a personal attack. And then whenever I would get in trouble in school, they would ground me from the video games. And actually, my mom would ground me from the video games. My dad would call me and tell me where they were hidden. And he said, pick it all up before she gets home. So I would be grounded from video games, and then I would go get the system, probably Super Nintendo, and hook it up and play it. And when Mom got home, I would just put it all back up. No harm, no foul. And she knows about this. She's been informed about this since. And so if I didn't go over to Adam's at the time, I would go through this Monday through Friday at school, being teased and bullied, and then coming home, and like I said, my parents would also do the sort of same thing, and I would be grounded from it. And at school, I was a very quiet kid, and I didn't really have a whole lot of friends that I can think of. I can remember one specifically. And I felt as if, the walls of my home were closing in on me, and the walls of school were closing in on me, and I wasn't doing well in school. And I felt like I needed to just scream and scream for help and run somewhere, but I had nowhere to run to. And that lasted all the way up until about 6th or 7th grade. So you figured, three-ish years of constantly going through these things, and you feel like it's all caving in on you. And actually, in my second year of 7th grade, and I say second year of 7th grade for a reason, we'll get into that next week, which is kind of a continuation of this story. I met a fella called Chris, and he played the Final Fantasy series, and I immediately latched on to him. Now I had a friend that knew what I was talking about in my crazy rants about how fantastic Final Fantasy VI is. He knew. And it was also interesting that I could point out differences between Adam and Chris, even though we all liked the same things. We were all three vastly different people. And that was a huge life lesson for me of like how different people are despite all liking the same things. But it helped out so much that now, Monday through Friday when I was at school, I had that person that like knew enough. He didn't like necessarily the same one that I did. I remember being in middle school and he came up, I think it was about 8th grade or so. He came up to me and he's like, I just got Final Fantasy VIII, and man, what a fantastic game. And I was like, I don't even know what the box art looks like. Like, I haven't got there yet. Now I had, at least through school, I had someone to talk to about it during school hours, and then on weekends I could talk to Adam about it. And at the time, that was enough. That got me through a lot of things. And in high school, in my freshman and sophomore year, I went to school in the same town. I moved up to high school, and there's a slightly bigger pool of different people there. And in my junior and senior year, I moved about 400 miles away, back home. I was born in Chicago, and that's where we moved back to for a couple of years. And you go from a school that has, I don't know, 200-300 people to a school that has 1,200. It's a little bit of a culture shock, but there was a bigger pool of people that had different interests, and I found a subgroup of people that played the Final Fantasy series. And so now I was 17 now, and I did find these group of people that did play the series. So just like I did with Chris, I latched onto him. Now I was 400 miles away, but I wasn't being teased for playing the series. And I think that's when the shift started happening of now gaming was more accepted during the time. You had more and more people that played the series, that played games at all. And so now I didn't feel like so much of an outsider that I had to shy away. Now I could proclaim, that I was a huge fan of the series. And I did exactly that. And I met a lot of really, really cool people up there. And then just in those couple of years, I moved back down to where I am currently, and I reconnected with old friends, and they seem to played, more games now. And so it really was sort of a wide acceptance of video games at that point. Now we're looking at about 2005 or so. It's pretty widely accepted now, and now you're starting to see merchandise related to your favorite games. I started to see Final Fantasy shirts and little toys, and that's probably about when all that started happening, if I remember correctly. And now you can find Final Fantasy stuff everywhere at this point. And I was so happy to finally see all of these things, because growing up, there was none of that we knew of. I know in Japan they had figurines and stuff the entire time, but here it was very different. And like I said, it was almost shunned in a way. But by 2005, 2006, it was the culture vastly changed. And now, wow, like it's almost, you don't play games? Like, what's wrong with you? You don't play games. And so to see that transition happen over the course of a decade or so, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing to see. And even heading into the future, like, I'm really excited to see. And I'll get into that in a future video or podcast or something. And I think taking all of those experiences of not having people that I could connect with about playing the Final Fantasy series, I think that had a huge role in why I started this YouTube channel and podcast and stuff. Because immediately when I was creating a channel, I thought, well, why am I doing this? Why am I going to spend time making content, and starting with an audience of 0? Why am I going to put in the effort of starting this thing? And the answer was really to build a community. That was my very first answer, to find the people that love the series as much as I do, if not more, and be friends with them. Because I didn't have that for a long time. I had my cousin Adam and I had Chris, but that was it. And now, I mean, what are we sitting at as far as sub count goes? As of right now, we're sitting at 414 subscribers. That's 414 people that I can talk to about the Final Fantasy series. And that's nuts to me. Like, and that's such a crazy number. Something that I started about 7 months ago or so. Now I've got 400 something amigos that I can talk about the Final Fantasy series with, and that's fantastic. And that's why I always offer to have everybody comment, because like the spice of life is hearing other stories, is connecting with people in different ways. And just like I noticed with Adam and Chris being very different people, now you can take that, and now it's on a much bigger scale than 2 people. Now it's 400. So I can hear the different stories of, I grew up with Final Fantasy and this happened. And that's why in the top of this podcast, I really want to hear other people's stories growing up with it, or maybe you're brand new to it. Because I think that, again, that's the fun part of connecting with people, is taking the one thing that we all love and like, how did you get into it? Like, I want to know genuinely, how did you get into the series? because I know all day how I got into it. And it's not exactly the best story, but I'll share it with anybody. Now tell me your story. Were you kicked around as a kid for playing it? Because I was. I don't know. I adore the series, and I have for a very long time. And who knew? 30 years ago this past summer, who knew that me just going over to my cousin Adam's house on a random weekend led to this moment where I am speaking into a camera, looking at show notes about a video game series that I very easily could never have seen. And what then? I've thought about different channel ideas making this one, but I've always wanted to make a Fun of Fantasy YouTube channel or podcast, and now I have both. And now there are 400 of you who share the same passion as I do, and that's wild to me. That's absolutely, it's almost like unbelievable in a way, because whenever I record these, there's only a microphone, there's only a camera. There's only camera number 2. What up, camera number 2? That's all I see. But then I put out the videos and then comments start rolling in. And some of my videos have 50, 60 comments. And that's what? On average, I get somewhere between 10 and 15 up to 20. But some have like 60. If I think about it too much, my head starts spinning. So I'm going to not think about it so much. But I do want to go ahead and stop here and tell all of you thank you for listening and watching, and absolutely leave me a comment telling me your story about the Final Fantasy series. Legitimately, I said it earlier and I'll say it again. I get notifications on every single comment that's posted, and I read every single comment that's every single morning. I take 30 while I drink coffee. I take 30 minutes and I read through every comment I got the day before. I don't know how long I can continue doing that as the channel grows, and it's growing. But for now, leave me a comment on any video. I'll see it. And actually, pretty soon, the community tab will open, and then I'll start posting things to it, and you guys can comment on that, and we can have a conversation there, too. And I've got some fun ideas for the community tab. I just got to wait till I get it. And I get that at 500 subs, so that's the goal for right now. But thank you so much for listening and watching every video, every podcast. I have a select group of you that watch everything, and I can think of some names right offhand, but I'm not going to do that, not yet, that I continually see in comments. And actually, a couple of you have actually messaged me, and we've had conversations, which is awesome. But I love you all. Thank you so much for being fans of the show and fans of the series, and I'd love to hear from you. But until then, I do want to thank Buzzsprout for hosting this podcast, and that's all I got for this week. So I'll see you around.